the barrel of a sawed-off shotgun pressed hard against her temple. "Don't play hero, Grandma," the robber sneered, blinded by the sight of a fragile nurse in oversized scrubs. He wanted the pharmacy keys. What he got was a decorated Helmand Province combat medic who hadn't felt this alive in a decade. At 2:14 a.m., the fluorescent lights of Providence Urgent Care flickered with a monotonous, agonizing hum. Located on the dreary, rain-slicked outskirts of Seattle, the clinic was a haven for the midnight casualties of a sleeping city. Colicky infants' minor kitchen burns, and the occasional sprained ankle from a late-night stumble. Cameron Harper sat behind the triage desk, meticulously sorting a fresh delivery of IV tubing. At 56, Cameron looked exactly how one might expect a lifelong night shift nurse to look. Her posture was slightly stooped, burdened by decades of leaning over gurneys and charting endless patient files. Silver streaks heavily threaded her dark hair, which she kept pulled back in a utilitarian no-nonsense bun. A pair of reading glasses rested on the bridge of her nose, attached to a beaded chain that draped around her neck. When she walked, she favored her left leg a subtle, persistent limp that she always blamed on a clumsy hiking trip in her 30s. To the rest of the staff, Cameron was the clinic's maternal figure. She baked banana bread on Tuesdays, covered shifts when the younger nurses were hungover, and had a bedside manner so soothing it could talk a panicked child out of an asthma attack. "Cameron, you want half of this sandwich?" Liam asked, snapping her out of her quiet focus. Liam was a 22-year-old pre-med student working the reception desk to pay off his mounting student loans. He was pale, perpetually exhausted, and looked at Cameron as if she were his own grandmother. "No, thank you, sweetheart," Cameron replied, her voice a soft, raspy alto. "My stomach can't handle pastrami past midnight anymore. You eat it. You need the protein if you're going to survive organic chemistry." Liam smiled, taking a massive bite. "It's just so dead tonight. I might actually get some flashcards done. You ever get bored, Cameron, just sitting here waiting for someone to walk in with a stubbed toe?" Cameron paused her fingers, resting lightly on a sealed package of lactated Ringer's solution. She looked past Liam, staring out the reinforced glass windows into the pitch-black parking lot. Bored. It was a word civilians used when they didn't appreciate the beauty of silence. She didn't tell Liam about her life before Providence Urgent Care. She didn't tell him about the blistering heat of the Helmand Province in 2010. She certainly didn't mention her time as a sergeant first class attached to the 212th Mobile Army Surgical Hospital, or the years she spent riding in the back of Black Hawk helicopters under heavy mortar fire, plunging her bare, bloody hands into the chests of young soldiers to manually clamp severed arteries while the sky rained shrapnel. The limp wasn't from a hiking accident. It was from a 7.62 round that had shattered her femur during a convoy ambush outside Kandahar. And the neatly framed nursing degree on the clinic wall conveniently omitted the silver star sitting in a velvet box at the bottom of her closet, awarded for dragging 3 wounded Marines to safety while taking sustained enemy fire. To Liam, to the doctors, to the world, she was just Cameron. Frail, sweet, predictable Cameron. "I prefer the quiet Liam," she finally answered, offering him a warm, practiced smile. "When this job gets exciting, it usually means someone is having a very bad day. I've had enough excitement for one lifetime." She stood up her left knee, clicking softly, and began to wipe down the triage counter with a bleach wipe. The smell of the antiseptic grounded her. It was a sterile, safe smell. Unlike the metallic tang of blood or the choking scent of cordite, that still occasionally visited her in her nightmares. "I'm going to head to the back and check the inventory in the lockup," Cameron said, tossing the wipe into the biohazard bin. "Page me if anyone walks in." "Will do, boss," Liam mumbled around his sandwich, already pulling out a thick textbook. Cameron walked down the short, brightly lit hallway toward the pharmacy storage. The clinic carried a substantial amount of Schedule II narcotics, oxycodone, fentanyl, morphine, essential for the severe trauma patients they sometimes stabilized before transferring them to Seattle Grace or Walter Reed. The heavy steel door required a dual authentication keycard and a PIN to open. As she punched in the code, the quiet of the clinic was suddenly violently shattered. It wasn't a sound Cameron had heard in civilian life often, but her nervous system recognized it instantly. It was the heavy, blunt force impact of a crowbar smashing through the reinforced safety glass of the front entrance. The glass didn't just break, it exploded inward with a deafening crash showering the waiting room in glittering deadly confetti. Cameron's hand froze over the keypad. Her heart, which a normal person's would be hammering against their ribs in pure terror, did the exact opposite. It slowed. The persistent ache in her knee vanished, flooded out by a sudden massive spike of adrenaline that her body had been trained to utilize like a weapon. The frail, stooped nurse evaporated. In the sterile hallway of the urgent care, the combat medic woke up. "Nobody moves, get on the damn ground right now." The voice was guttural, panicked, and loud, a dangerous combination. Cameron didn't peek her head around the corner immediately. Decades of tactical survival had taught her that moving blindly into a chaotic environment was a death sentence. Instead, she pressed her back flat against the cool plaster of the hallway wall, closing her eyes to isolate her hearing. She heard heavy-booted footsteps crunching over the broken glass. 2 sets. 2 hostiles she cataloged in her mind. "I said get down, kid, hands where I can see 'em," the lead voice barked. Cameron heard the heavy, sickening thud of something solid striking bone, followed instantly by Liam crying out in pain. The heavy thud was likely a firearm. A long gun, judging by the sweeping sound it made through the air. "Please, please, we don't have any cash," Liam sobbed, his voice cracking in absolute terror. "The register is empty." "I don't want the register, you stupid punk," the man snarled. "I want the lockbox. Where's the pharmacy? Where do you keep the Roxys and the fentanyl?" Cameron took a slow, silent breath in through her nose and out through her mouth. She opened her eyes. The maternal warmth in them was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating slate. She reached into the deep pocket of her oversized scrub top. Her fingers curled around her heavy-duty titanium trauma shears, a tool designed to cut through Kevlar and combat boots in seconds. It wasn't a firearm, but in the hands of someone who knew the exact anatomical pathways of the human body, it was devastating. She stepped out from the hallway, intentionally dragging her left foot slightly more than usual, ensuring she looked every bit the terrified elderly woman. Hey, stop it!" Cameron cried out, her voice trembling perfectly. She raised her hands, letting her shoulders slump as she shuffled into the waiting room. The scene was a mess. Wyatt Mercer stood in the center of the room, water dripping from his dark canvas jacket. He was a broad-shouldered man in his mid-30s with a patchy beard and frantic, aggressive eyes. In his hands, he held a sawed-off 12-gauge shotgun, the barrel currently pressed against the back of Liam's neck, who was face down on the linoleum, bleeding profusely from a split eyebrow. Behind Wyatt stood the second man, Gavin. He was younger, skeletal, and trembling violently, Gavin held a cheap silver 9mm handgun. His finger was resting inside the trigger guard. Terrible discipline. He was the wild card, the addict in withdrawal. Well, well, Wyatt sneered, turning the barrel of the shotgun away from Liam and aiming it squarely at Cameron's chest. Look what we have here, Florence Nightingale. Cameron let out a manufactured gasp, taking a step back and holding her hands higher. Please, she stammered, widening her eyes. Don't hurt him. He's just a student. We don't want any trouble. Wyatt laughed, a harsh grating sound. He stepped over Liam's trembling body and closed the distance between himself and Cameron. I don't want trouble either, Grandma. I want the keys to the heavy stuff. Open the vault. As Wyatt stood 2 feet away from her, the shotgun leveled at her abdomen. Cameron's mind worked at 1,000 frames a second. Target 1. Wyatt confident, aggressive, but arrogant. His stance is too wide. His center of gravity is off. He's holding the shotgun with one hand near the trigger, the other loosely gripping the pump. If the barrel is deflected upward, he has no leverage. Target 2. Gavin 15 feet away, sweating profusely, dilated pupils, opioid withdrawal. Hands are shaking too much for an accurate shot under pressure, but a negligent discharge is highly probable. I can get you what you want, Cameron said, letting her voice crack pitifully. The vault is in the back, but I need my key card. Please just don't shoot. Move it! Wyatt barked, gesturing with the barrel of the shotgun. And walk fast. If you try to hit a panic button, I'm going to paint this waiting room with the kids' brains. Got it? I understand, Cameron whimpered. She turned clumsily, ensuring she bumped her hip against the triage counter, reinforcing her fragility. She began a slow, agonizingly awkward shuffle down the hallway toward the pharmacy door. Wyatt followed close behind her, his boots heavy on the floor. Faster, you old bat, he shouted, shoving her roughly between her shoulder blades. It was a forceful shove. For a frail 56-year-old civilian nurse, it would have been enough to send her sprawling uncontrollably face first into the linoleum. But Cameron didn't sprawl. She used the kinetic energy of the shove. As she fell forward, she intentionally twisted her torso, her right hand reaching out not to brace her fall, but to grab the heavy steel O2 oxygen cylinder securely strapped to a medical crash cart in the hallway. Instead of hitting the ground hard, she dropped into a tight, controlled tactical crouch, sliding perfectly into the blind spot beneath Wyatt's line of sight. Wyatt blinked, momentarily confused by how quickly the old bat had vanished from his eye line. What the get-up? He yelled, stepping forward and lowering the shotgun to aim at the floor. He never got the chance to pull the trigger. From her crouched position, Cameron exploded upward with a velocity and precision that defied her age. Her left hand shot out, grabbing the searing hot barrel of the shotgun and violently shoving it upward toward the ceiling. At the exact same microsecond, her right hand gripping the solid titanium trauma shears drove forward like a piston. She didn't aim to kill. She aimed to incapacitate. The blunt, heavy fulcrum of the shears slammed directly into the brachial plexus nerve cluster, buried deep in Wyatt's armpit, right where his jacket was open. It was a perfectly placed strike, executed with the terrifying muscle memory of a woman who had spent years fighting for her life in the world's most unforgiving war zones. The impact sent a massive, paralyzing shockwave of electricity straight down Wyatt's radial nerve. His entire right arm went instantly numb, his fingers spasming violently as they completely lost their grip on the shotgun. Wyatt let out a confused, breathless choke as his weapon dropped away. The armed robber had severely underestimated the nurse. and as Cameron seamlessly caught the falling shotgun out of the air before it even hit the floor, Wyatt realized with a spike of ice-cold dread that he was no longer the predator in the room. He was the prey. The heavy sawed-off 12-gauge shotgun fell perfectly into Cameron's waiting left hand. She didn't rack the pump. Firing a devastating spread of buckshot inside a sterile medical facility with a civilian present was entirely out of the question. A weapon is only as good as the mind wielding it, and Cameron Harper's mind was a fortress of calculated tactical restraint. Wyatt gasped, his right arm dangling uselessly at his side like a severed cable. The nerve strike had completely paralyzed his limb. Confusion and blind panic washed over his features. He stumbled backward, his heavy boots squeaking against the polished linoleum, desperately trying to comprehend how the fragile, limping grandmother had suddenly morphed into a lethal close-quarters combatant. "You!" Wyatt choked out, his eyes wide with a sudden primal terror. He awkwardly swung his good left fist in a wide, desperate arc toward her face, aiming to crush her jaw. It was a slow, telegraphed punch born of sheer desperation. Cameron stepped inside his guard with the fluid, practiced grace of a phantom. She shifted her body weight, dropping her hips to lower her center of gravity, and drove the solid walnut stock of the captured shotgun directly into Wyatt's solar plexus. The hollow, sickening thud echoed sharply down the narrow hallway. All the oxygen was instantly violently evacuated from Wyatt's lungs. His eyes rolled back into his head as his diaphragm seized entirely. He folded in half like a broken folding chair, collapsing heavily onto the floor in a wheezing, breathless heap. Target 1 was neutralized. He wouldn't be moving or fighting back for a considerable amount of time. Cameron didn't pause to admire her work. In the brutal, unforgiving mathematics of combat, lingering was how you died. She immediately spun toward the waiting room, sweeping the hallway for target 2. Gavin was still standing near the shattered front entrance, 15 feet away. The skeletal, trembling addict had just witnessed his hulking, aggressive partner systematically dismantled in less than 4 seconds. The shock paralyzed him for a fatal heartbeat. Then the opioid withdrawal and adrenaline crashed together, creating a cocktail of sheer, unadulterated panic. "Wyatt!" Gavin shrieked, his voice cracking into a high-pitched wail. His shaking hands gripped the silver 9mm handgun. With absolutely no trigger discipline, no stance, and his eyes practically squeezed shut, Gavin yanked the trigger. Bang, bang, bang! The deafening reports of the handgun in the enclosed clinic were physically agonizing. The muzzle flashes briefly illuminated the dim waiting room in harsh strobe light yellow. Bullets tore blindly through the air, completely uncontrolled. One round shattered the heavy glass of the reception partition, raining thousands of tiny crystalline shards over Liam, who screamed and curled tighter into a fetal position beneath the triage desk. Another round buried itself deep into the drywall, just inches from Cameron's left shoulder, showering her scrub top with fine white gypsum dust. Cameron didn't flinch. She didn't scream. Her training forged in the blistering bloody heat of the Helmand province overrode any civilian instinct to freeze. She instantly dropped low, rolling behind a heavy steel crash cart loaded with defibrillators and emergency airway supplies. It wasn't perfect cover, but the thick metal frame would deflect a hollow .9mm round. "Liam, stay perfectly flat," Cameron commanded. Her voice was no longer the soft, raspy alto of the maternal night nurse. It was the sharp, booming baritone of a sergeant first class orchestrating a battlefield maneuver. It carried an absolute, unquestionable authority that cut straight through the deafening ringing in Liam's ears. Gavin kept firing blindly, emptying the magazine into the hallway. Bullets chewed up the ceiling tiles and shattered the fluorescent light fixtures, plunging the corridor into strobing darkness as emergency backup lights flickered to life, casting eerie blood-red shadows across the floor. He's panic firing. He's not tracking targets. He's just trying to create space. Cameron analyzed rapidly, her back pressed hard against the steel cart. She counted the deafening cracks. 7, 8, 9, 10. A standard cheap 9mm usually held 10 to 15 rounds. She couldn't risk waiting for him to empty the magazine entirely. A stray bullet was mathematically bound to strike Liam eventually. She needed a diversion, and she needed to close the distance immediately. Cameron's eyes darted across the supplies strapped to the crash cart. Her gaze locked onto a large red heavy-duty chemical fire extinguisher mounted in a recessed wall bracket just 2 feet to her right. Remaining in a low crouch, ignoring the burning ache in her scarred femur, Cameron reached out and yanked the heavy extinguisher from its mounting. She quickly pulled the metal safety pin, the tiny clink completely masked by Gavin's continued erratic gunfire. "Stay away, I'll kill you. I swear to God, I'll kill you both," Gavin screamed hysterically, waving the gun violently through the air. Cameron took a deep breath, visualizing the layout of the room. She aggressively hurled the heavy red canister out from behind the cart, sliding it forcefully across the smooth linoleum floor directly toward Gavin's position. The movement instantly caught the addict's hyper-vigilant attention. Mistaking the sliding red cylinder for a threat or a rolling explosive, Gavin panicked entirely. He swung the 9mm downward and fired 3 rapid shots at the moving target. The final bullet struck the pressurized canister dead center. The extinguisher catastrophically ruptured with a massive concussive hiss. A dense, blinding cloud of thick white monoammonium phosphate powder violently exploded outward, instantly filling the reception area in an impenetrable, choking blizzard. Gavin choked, stumbling backward as the harsh chemical powder flooded his eyes and throat, blinding him completely. Now, Cameron moved. She didn't charge straight through the cloud. That would be a tactical error. Instead, she bolted silently to her left, diving through the open doorway of the adjacent X-ray observation room. She navigated the dark, familiar room purely by memory, slipping out the secondary door that opened directly behind the reception desk, outflanking the blinded gunman entirely. Gavin was coughing violently, frantically rubbing his burning eyes with his left hand, while wildly waving the empty 9mm in his right. He was completely disoriented, stumbling backward through the thick white smoke. "Wyatt, get up, we gotta go." Gavin hacked his boots, slipping on the powder-coated floor. He took one blind step too far backward. His heel caught the heavy steel leg of an overturned IV pole. Gavin lost his balance completely. He tipped backward, flailing his arms in a desperate attempt to stay upright. As he fell, his finger convulsed one final time on the trigger of the 9mm. A single final deafening crack echoed through the room. It was a negligent discharge, the direct result of terrible weapon discipline and blind panic. But the bullet didn't hit Cameron. It didn't hit Liam. Gavin hit the floor hard, a sharp, horrific scream ripping from his throat. The cheap firearm clattered uselessly away into the white mist. Cameron emerged from the shadows like a ghost, closing the distance in 3 massive strides. She kicked the handgun under a row of waiting room chairs, securing the weapon. She quickly grabbed Gavin by his soaked collar, fully prepared to physically restrain him. But as the chemical dust slowly began to settle under the red emergency lights, Cameron looked down and realized the fight was already completely over. Gavin lay thrashing on the floor, clutching his upper left thigh. A dark, terrifyingly wet stain was spreading across his faded denim jeans with sickening speed. The negligent discharge had gone straight through his own leg at point-blank range. Cameron didn't need to examine the wound closely to recognize the severity. The blood wasn't just oozing, it was violently pulsing. Bright, highly oxygenated arterial blood was jetting forcefully from the exit wound with every rapid, panicked beat of Gavin's racing heart. Femoral artery. In a civilian, this injury meant death in approximately 3 to 4 minutes. On the battlefield, it was a race against a ticking clock that Cameron had run 100 times before. The combat medic, who had just ruthlessly dismantled 2 armed robbers, vanished instantly. In her place, the seasoned, dedicated trauma nurse returned. The transition was seamless, a testament to an oath she had sworn long before she ever picked up a weapon. First, do no harm. Second, save the life in front of you. Liam, Cameron roared, her voice echoing through the clinic. Get out from under the desk, call 911. Tell them we have a code red gunshot wound to the femoral artery. Massive hemorrhaging. I need paramedics and police now. Liam, shaking uncontrollably, crawled out from under the shattered desk, his face pale and covered in fine glass dust. Cameron, what happened? Do it now, Liam, move, she ordered, dropping to her knees directly into the pooling blood beside the thrashing, screaming robber. I'm dying, oh God, it burns, I'm dying, Gavin shrieked, his hands weakly clawing at his leg, completely useless against the massive arterial pressure. Look at me, Cameron commanded sharply, grabbing his chin with her blood-slicked hand and forcing him to meet her steely gaze. You are not going to die today. I won't allow it. But you need to stop thrashing or you will bleed out before the ambulance clears the intersection. Do you understand me? Gavin nodded weakly, his lips already turning a faint cyanotic blue from rapid blood loss. Cameron didn't have time to run back to the crash cart for a standardized CAT tourniquet. She improvised with terrifying speed. She unclipped the thick, heavy-duty nylon lanyard from around her neck, the one holding her ID badge and access keys. She wrapped the thick nylon strap high and tight around Gavin's upper thigh, just inches below his groin. This is going to hurt worse than the bullet, she warned him coldly. She grabbed the heavy titanium trauma shears from her pocket, slipped one loop of the handle beneath the nylon lanyard, and began to forcefully twist. She used the shears as a makeshift windlass, mechanically cranking the nylon tighter and tighter into the muscle tissue, completely crushing the severed femoral artery against the femur bone. Gavin screamed in absolute agony, a sound that would have haunted a normal person. Cameron merely gritted her teeth, ignoring the burning ache in her own scarred leg, using her entire body weight to hold the improvised tourniquet in place. She watched the wound intently. The violent pulsing jet of bright red blood slowed, sputtered, and finally stopped, replaced by a slow, manageable oozing. Liam, Cameron shouted over her shoulder, her hands locked in a death grip on the bloody shears. Grab the gauze from the triage cart. All of it I need to pack the wound cavity. For the next 10 minutes, the Providence Urgent Care Clinic was perfectly quiet, save for Gavin's shallow, ragged breathing and the distant approaching wail of police sirens. Cameron knelt in a massive pool of the robber's blood, her hands firmly locked, keeping him tethered to the world of the living. Wyatt remained unconscious down the hall, When the Seattle Police Department SWAT team finally breached the shattered front entrance, sweeping the room with assault rifles and blinding tactical flashlights, they completely froze at the surreal scene before them. They expected to find hostages. They expected dead bodies. Instead, they found two incapacitated armed robbers. One was out cold from a blunt force strike. The other was fighting for his life, actively being saved by a 56-year-old nurse with silver hair, a beaded glasses chain, and a uniform soaked to the elbows in blood. Officer Miller, a seasoned veteran of the force, slowly lowered his rifle, staring at Cameron in absolute bewilderment. "Ma'am, did you do this? Are you injured?" Cameron didn't look up from Gavin's pale face. Her grip on the tourniquet never loosened. "I am uninjured, officer. The suspect has a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the left femoral. Tourniquet applied at 0241 hours. He's stabilized but going into hypovolemic shock. I need your medics in here with heavy IV fluids immediately." Miller blinked, entirely thrown off by her precise military-grade medical report. "Yes, ma'am. Medics are right behind us." He looked around the devastated clinic, taking in the shattered glass, the discharged shotgun on the floor, and the unconscious Wyatt. "Ma'am, how did you manage to neutralize two armed men?" Cameron finally looked up. Under the harsh glare of the tactical flashlights, the wrinkles around her eyes seemed to deepen, bearing the heavy weight of a past she could never truly leave behind. "They asked for the heavy stuff," Cameron said softly, her raspy alto returning. She offered the stunned officer a faint, tired smile. "I just gave them exactly what they asked for." Across the room, Liam stood wrapped in a thermal shock blanket, staring at the woman who baked banana bread